All right, in this video we are going to finish the chapter on the integumentary system. So last time we left off by talking about the different pigments that give skin its color. So now we're going to talk about accessory structures of the skin. So this would include things like the hair and nails and different glands, so sweat and oil glands and wax glands. And then we're going to talk about some other kind of clinical implications associated with the skin, like skin cancers and burns and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about our accessory structures. So the first accessory structure is going to be hair, all right? And so we're just going to talk about in general kind of the structure of hair and the function of some of those structures. So with the hair, it's broken down into the shaft, which gives hair its color. So we have the shaft of the hair, and typically that's going to be above the surface of the skin. And then you have the root of the hair that is going to be below the surface of the skin. Okay, and so we also have the hair follicle, which is would be located down here. All right, so we have our hair follicle. This is where all the growth of the hair is going to occur, okay? So that's where all the important stuff for the hair to live is located, okay? So we have, let's first talk about the matrix of the hair, okay? And so the matrix of the hair isn't shown all that well. You can kind of see it. It's this like dark spot here, right, on the hair. Okay, and so I'll point to it here. All right, that's the hair matrix. The importance of the hair matrix is that it has cells that undergo mitosis. All right, so mitosis, this is where the hair grows. It grows from the matrix of the hair follicle. Okay. And then associated with that matrix, and I'll kind of add this below it, is the hair papilla, right? So the papilla, we talked about the word papilla last time with the dermal papilla. Remember, that's just kind of like a projection. So the papilla here with the hair is going to be this kind of projection just below it. And that papilla is going to be really important because it contains blood vessels, all right? And so those blood vessels are going to supply those cells that are undergoing mitosis and helping the hair to grow with nutrients, okay? So that papilla is located just below those cells of the hair matrix, all right? And then also associated with the hair, we have the hair root plexus, all right? And so this is going to be a series of nerve endings that function to sense movement of the hair, right? So they detect movement. So if somebody kind of lightly brushes against the hairs on your arm, you can feel that, right? If you just close your eyes, you can feel those hairs moving. That's because you have these hair root plexuses here, right? They kind of wrap around that follicle of the hair, and if the hair is bent, it'll detect that movement and tell your brain that the hair is being moved. Okay, so that's the basics of kind of hair. Also associated with hair is this really cool muscle, and so this is a smooth muscle, so it's an involuntary muscle called the Erector Pili muscle. So the function of the Erector Pili muscle is to make the hair stand up, okay? And so this is actually what causes goosebumps. And you can't control goosebumps, all right? So that is a smooth muscle, and you can actually see it. This is going to be a long arrow. If we come all the way around here, all right, that's what we're seeing here, okay? So it's attached to the hair, and it will contract and pull the hair so it stands up, right? It makes your hair stand on end. Okay. All right, so that's the Erector Pili muscle with the hair. So associated with the hair is a gland. So we're going to talk about glands now. So with hair follicles, we always have associated the sebaceous glands. Okay, and so the sebaceous glands are going to be oil glands. They secrete sebum, which is really just oil. Okay, and so you can see them here on this picture. All right, so these are going to be our sebaceous glands. Okay, and they're going to secrete their oil onto that hair shaft, and it moves up towards the surface, and then that oil will help to soften the hair and keep it moisturized, as well as the skin, all right, around the hair. Okay, so it helps to moisturize the skin, soften the hair, and also it functions to help reduce bacterial growth. Okay, so there's salts and stuff in the oil, so it's oil, salts that help to reduce bacterial growth, and some cholesterol. Okay, so it provides moisture and it decreases bacterial growth. Okay. And so when you are looking on a microscope slide, right, if you're in lab and you're trying to identify a sebaceous gland on a microscope slide of the skin, which you should have to do in lab, if you see a gland like this that is right next to a hair follicle, and so usually on microscope slides, hair follicles, you're not going to see the hair go all the way up to the surface of the skin like this. What you'll usually see is kind of like just like a teardrop shape like this that kind of get cut, like cuts off like that, right? And you'll see a sebaceous gland though associated very close to it, like right next to it. And so that is going to be your sebaceous gland, all right? And they usually will look like these. This is a good example here, actually, like this, just like a clump of cells, okay? It's not organized in like a circle or anything like that. It's just this kind of mass of cells, and there'll be another mass of cells next to it. That is going to be your sebaceous glands, okay? All right. And so then also in the skin, we have pseudoriferous glands. So pseudoriferous glands are going to be our sweat glands. So they make sweat. We know sweat is important for maintaining and regulating temperature. That's one of the big products or the big functions of the pseudoriferous glands is temperature regulation. There are two types of pseudoriferous glands you'll see mentioned probably in your textbook. There's a merocrine sweat gland and an apocrine sweat gland. I just wanted to mention them. You don't have to know that much about the differences between them, but I wanted to mention them because they originally got their names because they were thought to secrete in two different ways. So obviously this one was thought to secrete in a merocrine fashion, and this was thought to secrete in an apocrine fashion. It was later found out, and we now know that they both secrete through merocrine secretions. Okay, so sweat glands secrete through a merocrine secretion, so just exocytosis of that sweat, but they kept the names, and so that can be confusing. But they're both acting through merocrine secretion. All right, they just make slightly different types of secretions, and you can read about that if you want to, but it's not going to be emphasized on your exam or anything like that. All right, and they're located generally in different places on the body. Okay, and so when you're looking at a sweat gland on a microscope, the way to tell it from a pseudoriferous gland or from a sebaceous gland is because they basically look like these, it's kind of like, looks like a big coiled mass of yarn, right? So if we saw this and it wasn't cut, right, it would just look like this big coiled mass of yarn like this. All right, and so then when you make a microscope slide, you slice through the tissues, and so you're slicing through those coils of yarn. So you get these kind of like round sections of cells because you've cut through those little pieces. You can see this one's kind of like a little loop of yarn that you got on the side, right? Got a little circle here. And so this is what the sweat glands will look like. versus our sebaceous glands, we said, are really just like a mass, a big old blob of cells, not in any kind of structure. These will be kind of like you've cross-sectioned a piece of spaghetti. Okay? All right. So that's our Pseudoriferous glands. They're going to make sweat and help to regulate temperature. And then our last type of gland is a little less common. It's a Ceruminous gland. Okay, so this is a modified type of sweat gland that makes wax. All right, so it's a wax gland. Obviously we know, so that wax is called cerumen. That's why it's called a ceruminous gland. Okay, it's kind of like a sticky, waxy substance. It's located generally in your ear. All right, it's an apocrine. This one's an apocrine gland. All right, so it secretes a little portion of the cell when it makes that wax. And the function of the wax is to help trap any debris from getting down into your ear canal, right? So it's very sticky, which I'm sure you know. And so it can help to prevent things from getting down deep into your ear canal. All right. Okay, so that's our ceruminous gland. And then our last accessory structure is the nails. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the nails. They're pretty similar in the way they're arranged to a hair follicle, all right, to our hair. So we have our nail root, and it has a matrix. This is where that nail would grow from. All right, a lot of times it's called like the nail bed. All right, so mitosis, growth. And then you have the nail plate, which is the kind of hard part of the nail that you can see that's sitting kind of on top of the skin. Okay, so this is the visible portion. All right, and it usually has kind of a pinkish appearance to it because the skin underneath that nail plate is very, very thin. So you can see the blood vessels in that connective tissue underneath very, very easily. And that actually makes the nail plate a very good place to look to kind of assess someone's oxygenation of their blood, right, in a medical setting. Okay, so you can always look at their nails, make sure they're nice and pink. They're not pale or kind of blue would be really bad. All right, and that's a very good thing to always keep in mind. Okay, and so nails are made of the same protein found in hairs. They're both made of keratin. They're just slightly different types of keratin. So one is more flexible with hair. The keratin used for nails is obviously much more rigid, making the nails really hard. But they're both made of keratin. Okay? All right. So now let's talk about wound healing. All right, we talked a little bit about tissue repair before, so we're going to kind of add to that with wound healing. Okay. All right, so the process of wound healing is obviously going to depend on how deep the wound goes. So if the wound is very superficial, if it only affects the epidermis, that would be a very simple healing process, right? So the epithelial cells would just migrate and multiply, all right, to fill that gap. Okay, and so there would be no bleeding if the damage was just to the epidermis to fill in the damage. Okay, right, because there's no blood vessels in the epithelium. So those cells would just move in to repair that space, right? Because remember, with contact inhibition, they would just move towards each other until they touch. When they do, they'll stop migrating and multiplying to fill that space. Okay, so then what's going to be more involved is if you have a very deep wound. Okay, so obviously this wound here, right, we've gone past our epidermis, which is here, right, we're down deep into the dermis, almost touching the hypodermis down here. Okay, so this is a very deep wound. And so there's going to be 4 stages involved in this repair process. All right, so the first stage is inflammation. We talked about this before with our kind of tissue repair section. So inflammation involves those mast cells. So that's what they're showing here, right? These are 2 mast cells moving into that area because they sensed tissue damage. All right, they're going to get there. They're going to release histamine. All right, so this would be histamine being released. That's going to cause inflammation. Inflammation, remember, you have redness, you have swelling, you have heat, all right? And so all of that is going to start attracting all of the other cells we need in order to repair that tissue, okay? So then that leads us into our second stage, which is migration, okay? And so with migration, at this point, obviously we have a bunch of cells moving into the area. They're going to be fibroblasts, right? And those are going to help to make new connective tissue. So we're going to form granulation tissue in this step. All right, so granulation tissue is formed here. We're going to have a lot of fibroblasts. You would have a lot of white blood cells there to kind of fight off any debris or infection that might be getting into that open wound so it doesn't get into the bloodstream. And so then you start to kind of repair and build back that collagen, right? Migration also refers to, you can see here, right, this stratum basale, this basal layer of the epidermis is migrating down to kind of reform around that area. All right. So the basal layer of the epidermis migrates to reform, right? Because remember, it's looking for that contact inhibition. It wants to see other, right, other basal cells on the other side of it here. So it's going to keep migrating. This side will keep migrating until they meet, and then you have that contact inhibition. Okay, and so then from there, we move to the, so we have here to here, we have our proliferation phase. All right, so proliferation means we are multiplying and dividing, okay? And so here, in particular, those basal cells, all right, so now they've met each other, they've come into contact, they're going to start multiplying and dividing to fill in this area with those epidermal cells, okay? So the basal cells multiply. All right, and so this can take about a week. All right, this process of proliferation. All right, and so then our last phase is the maturation phase. And so here is the final phase. We have possible scar formation. All right, just depending on how that tissue is repaired. And actually everybody heals a little differently, all right? So everybody has a slightly different capacity for repairing tissue. One possibility with tissue repair of the skin in particular is the formation of a keloid type of scar, all right? And so this is where the tissue, when it repairs, it overgrows, all right? So the tissue overgrows and it results in a raised scar. All right, so a keloid type of scar, instead of, you can see this one's actually kind of indented a little bit. All right, this would actually look kind of raised like that. All right, And sometimes, sometimes they can be very pronounced, right? So these very large keloid scars. So that's also possible. So this, like the color of the scar, they can be white or they can be pink, kind of depends on the level of connective tissue there. All right. If the scar tissue is very thin, all right, and you can kind of almost see like where the blood vessels are beneath, you have a thin layer of epidermis, that would give kind of a pink color to the scar tissue. If there's a lot of collagen built up, it might look more white. All right. So scars can be very different depending on the person and how their skin typically heals. Okay. So now let's talk about types of skin cancer. Whoops, sorry. Okay. And so we're going to talk about the 3 types of skin cancer, kind of what cells they originate from and how severe they are relative to each other. Okay. So we're going to start with a basal cell carcinoma. So the basal cell carcinoma, right? And remember, cancer is an overproliferation of cells. So they're growing kind of without any regulation, right? They're growing out of control. So the cells in this case that are growing out of control are the cells of the stratum basale, right? Those mitotic cells. Okay. With basal cell carcinoma, this is a very slow growing type of cancer. All right. And so typically it is not very likely to metastasize. And so we talked about the word metastasize, and that means that this skin cancer could spread to a different type of tissue or a different organ. And so it does not metastasize easily. All right. And so that means that it's possible, especially, the earlier you catch it, the easier it is to just surgically remove that area of carcinoma, those cancer cells, and then, use some medications, and then everything will be okay, right? Because it's not spreading. So it's not a very aggressive cancer, and it's actually the most common type of skin cancer. All right, about 8 out of 10 skin cancer cases is going to be a basal cell carcinoma. All right, and then the next type is going to be a squamous cell carcinoma. So this would affect essentially all the layers above the stratum basale. All right, so middle and top layers of the epidermis. All right. And so this one is just slightly more aggressive than the basal cell carcinoma. It is still relatively slow to metastasize, right? It'll slowly metastasize. So the earlier, again, you catch these, the less likely it will have metastasized. All right. So early checks, right? If you have like a weird, lesion or something on your skin or a weird mole, get it checked early, because the earlier you can catch it, the more likely you are to get it before it spreads. Okay. And so this one is kind of like 2 out of 10 cases are going to be squamous cell. Okay, and then lastly, we have the melanoma. So this would be the most severe type of skin cancer. It is extremely malignant. All right, so very cancerous, very dangerous. It metastasizes pretty easily. And it comes from, and the name kind of tells you, melanocytes. All right, so it's from overgrowth of melanocytes. All right, and this is why you're always told by dermatologists you want to monitor any moles or any freckles that you have that seem to not have a regular shape, right? They have kind of an irregular boundary, or maybe they're changing shape. They shouldn't change shape over time. you would want to monitor those and have, a dermatologist look at them if you're concerned. Okay, because it's those melanocytes that cause melanoma. Okay, and these can be very, 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 very severe. Okay. All right, so those are the 3 types of skin cancer. And our last topic is going to be to talk about burns. Okay, and so with burns, we're just going to discuss the degree of burns and which layers of the skin are affected by each. Okay, so we'll start off with our 1st degree burns. All right, so this is a very superficial burn. It would only affect the epidermis. All right, that certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. Okay, you're just not, it's going to be much easier to heal, and it'll be much less severe. Okay, it's certainly not life-threatening, but we all know all burns hurt quite a bit. Okay, so 1st degree burn just affects the epidermis. 2nd degree burn affects the epidermis and part of the dermis. All right, and so sometimes they're called a partial thickness burn. Okay, because it's only part of the dermis, so partial thickness with those. And so kind of characteristic of these is going to be blistering. All right, you'll see blistering, and that will indicate a 2nd degree burn. Okay, all right, so then if you have a burn that goes through the epidermis and the entire dermis all the way down to that subcutaneous tissue, that is going to be a 3rd degree burn. All right, so epidermis and all of the dermis. Okay, and so that is also called a full thickness burn. Okay, and so these are very, very serious, especially if they're covering large areas of the body. They can be not painful, all right? Sometimes there is no pain associated because the actual nerve endings have been burned off and destroyed, all right? So not painful, and that's most of the time, okay? And so the concern with these 3rd degree burns, there's a few different concerns. All right, so obviously infection is a huge concern because the skin and all of these secretions from all these glands provide this barrier to prevent bacteria from getting into all of these blood vessels. So infection is a very serious concern. And also remember, a major function of the skin is to be a barrier that prevents water loss. And so dehydration and loss of water is a huge problem with burn patients, all right, because they don't have that skin preventing water from just evaporating. And so they can easily dehydrate and lose water. And then they also don't have the skin acting for temperature regulation. And so frequently burn patients will have a problem with regulating their temperature. And so they can't sweat, all right? They also don't have the skin insulating and helping to regulate the temperature, okay? All right, so those are the 3 types of burns. They just differ based on thickness and then obviously severity. And so that is the end of this chapter. All right. And so then in our next chapter, we are going to start talking about bones and bone tissue.